Welcome to another CHRO Conversation, hosted by the Center for Executive Succession at the Darla Moore School of Business. I'm your host, Anthony Nyberg, and today we are speaking with Lucien Alziari. Lucien is the Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer of Prudential Financial, a Fortune 50 financial services company. Prior to Prudential, Lucien was the CHRO of A.P. Moller Maersk, a global shipping and energy conglomerate with about 90,000 employees and operations in over 130 countries worldwide. Prior to that, he was the CHRO of Avon Products, and he formerly served on the board of directors of Clarks, a UK-based global footwear company, and he's the former chair of the Center for Executive Succession. Lucien, as always, it is a great delight to be able to talk to you. So thank you very much for joining us.
Nice to see you again. Thank you.
So I'd like to start with talking a little bit about strategy, because I know I've heard you say a lot of times that even to do HR well, or maybe especially to do HR well, we have to start by thinking about the company's strategy. Can you say a little bit about what strategy means to you?
Yeah, I think you can get into sort of very technical definitions of what strategy really means. But for me, it's just, do you have a sense of, where the company is choosing to play? So that could be markets, it could be geographies, but where do you think the company has a distinctive business proposition? And then what gives your business the opportunity to win in those competitive spaces? And I think as the HR leader, you have two responsibilities. The most important one is just as a leader of the business, just like the rest of your peer group, you have to have your own points of view on where can your business succeed and win, and how do you stack up versus competitors? What does that competitive space look like? And that to me is sort of the fundamental grounding that then gives you the opportunity to bring the particular expertise that we hopefully bring in, talent and capabilities and other aspects of HR. But you have to be as passionate about the business winning as any of your business leaders or your CFO or any of your other peers.
So terrific. Can you tie that a little bit more into how that really plays out for you from an HR perspective?
Yeah, so I'm a member of our executive leadership team at Prudential. For the last 15 months. We've had a pretty deep strategy process, which really predates the pandemic, but certainly got accelerated by the pandemic, about, how do we feel about our overall business strategy, our mix of businesses, our growth potential. And I've been in the middle of all of those discussions for the last 15 months, and I would say I'm expected to be an equal contributor to that process. And that's before we get to talk about any of the talent implications or capability implications. It's really the business of the business. But I think the real gift we can bring is, because we are well informed on the talent that we have, the capabilities that we have or could have, that actually becomes part of your thinking about where you can compete and win. So it's not just what's the business strategy, therefore what are the HR implications. It's almost sometimes, because of our deep knowledge of HR, how does that actually enable the company to go after new opportunities that it may not think of?
So that sounds like, because I'm sure a lot of companies out there are still in a spot where they don't fully include HR in those kind of strategic decisions, but it sounds like there ought to be a bit of a competitive advantage for those companies that do bring in that perspective. Particularly, I think what you were saying was you can help guide where the company can best compete.
Yes, and if there isn't a discernible difference between the companies where the HR leader is sort of fully entrenched and contributing to that process, and others where they're excluded, that would be a wake-up call for us as a function. But I think the best companies tend to have this sort of trio right at the heart of the company, and it's the combination of the CEO, the CFO, and the chief HR officer. In my experience, high-performing companies tend to have that trio very well, working as a combination, as a combined team.
Terrific. And I've heard you when you've talked about prioritizing the responsibilities that you have, particularly from the CHRO role, but in HR in general, really talking about key questions that you try to ensure that you're focusing on. Can you share a little bit about what those key questions are for you and how they fit into this general idea of strategy?
Yeah, I think the most fundamental question is, what's going to make our business win? It sounds like a fairly basic question, but it's like the most fundamental question that a CEO has. You may be in a business where you have one line of business that is sort of spread across different geographies, or you may be in a company like Prudential where we have a number of different businesses. So you're asking that question at a couple of levels, business by business, and then thinking about, does the collection of businesses, when you put it together as an overall corporation, is the whole greater than the sum of the parts? Is it actually a complementary business mix, or are you just kind of a holding company? But the fundamental question is, does each of those businesses have a vision to win, and is that based in wishful thinking, or is it based in real deep thinking about understanding the unique capabilities that it can bring to a marketplace that give it a distinct advantage versus competitors? And in order to answer that question, you need to understand the competitive space that you're playing in and understand how you stack up versus competitors, not how you wish you stack up versus competitors, but what's the reality? The Jim Collins thing about, what are the brutal facts? Right? Be very, very fact-based, but then be very purposeful about sort of working from the facts to build the capabilities so that your company truly can win on a sustainable basis.
And so when you're thinking in that way and in that strategic way, and now you've added really going from a fact basis, are you playing that out throughout the organization? I mean, all the way down to whatever might be considered kind of lower levels in the organization, or is that really more of a top level perspective?
I think it's more prominent in the more senior roles because that's the nature of the senior roles. And so I would expect that would be a larger proportion of the time of my role than, say, a frontline HR representative in a business. However, I would expect the frontline HR representative in a business to have that same curiosity about, if I'm in the supply chain, well, then how does the supply chain fit within the overall strategy of the company? What's the contribution that we make? What are we expected to do? How well are we doing it? What's going to help us do it better? How do we compete versus how do the others that we compete against, how do they do it? What can we learn from that? So I guess the fundamental premise here, Anthony, is we are expected to bring HR expertise, but I expect HR people to bring business curiosity, which turns into business expertise.
And so that is one of those skills that I think many people outside of HR would not have appreciated was really necessary for succeeding well in HR. But you're saying you want that top to bottom in your organization.
Yep, and we acknowledge that is a lifetime journey. So I am still learning at my ripe old age. I've been learning all the way along. But the journey starts on day one. So at the same time as you are learning HR and the concepts and theory of HR, I would also want you to be just as curious about the business of the business and learning about, what makes businesses work, what makes businesses compete and win.
And pretty related to this idea of the big questions, but I've heard you talk about really trying to focus on three things at any one point in time. Can you share a little bit? Are those three things constantly changing? Are those really three big things that you focus on kind of throughout at least some particular run in the organization's business cycle, et cetera?
Yeah, I've been privileged in my career to have worked with a lot of very senior people, and most of them very successful. And so I've always been curious about sort of what are the patterns that the most successful leaders seem to share. And one of them is just this ability to focus and focus only on the things that really, really make a difference. And so one of the CEOs that I had early exposure to in my career used to talk about make big changes to big things, a few big changes to a few big things, rather than lots of small changes to lots of small things. And if I study the CEOs that I've worked with who've been most effective, they do tend to work through a whole load of complexity because they're all running very, very complex businesses. But they boil it down to, at the end, what's going to make this company move forward is typically no more than three things. And they do that to kind of make sense of the world, but to help the organization make sense of the world and have clarity of purpose, clarity of sort of strategy and execution. And so in that, obviously, it's really important that you choose the right three things. And at the level of the company that we all play at now, you don't get to change that every 6 months because then the organization gets very confused and distracted. And so in answer to part of the question, I think what I look for is three things that will take several years to accomplish. Now, they're directional, and the particular initiatives that you've got placed at any one time may change from year to year, but they're all in service of these overall three goals.
So as you noted there, it's really important that you get those three things correct. Okay?
Yep.
So how do you make sure that, especially if you're thinking about it from the HR function, how do you make sure you do that?
Well, I think you start with business and having hopefully a deep sense of what's most important for your company to win from a business point of view. And so that takes us back to the conversation we just had about deep strategy and really understanding what's going to make the business win in the marketplace. And then once I've got that clear in my own mind, or at least my own sort of theory of the case around that, then I can go back into my own stream of logic around, okay, what does that mean from a capabilities point of view? Where is good enough? Where do we need to be better than everybody else in order to win? And once I'm clear on that from a capabilities point of view, that gives me a much more nuanced understanding then of where does talent really make a difference in the business? Where does our talent need to be better than everybody else's? And then finally, I boil that down to the notion of critical roles, that not all roles make an equal contribution to the success of the company. They're all important because if they're not, we shouldn't have them. But some roles, based upon strategy, play a disproportionate impact on the overall company's success at any point in time.
So I want to follow up on that part, and the good is good enough in just a moment. But before that, so this is something you do, the kind of focusing on these three ideas that are going to take a long period of time. Is that, again, something that really is mostly at the top of the organization? Or do you expect the people reporting to you to have that same kind of focus, but presumably that has to be aligned with the three things you're trying to do?
Yeah, I don't think you want multiple lists. I think this is a top of the company responsibility. It's a C-suite accountability. And the beauty of it is that it does provide commonality and some consistency so that the business knows what to expect overall And I would look for my direct report team, A, to be deeply involved in the crafting of what those three are, and then to make sure that whatever initiatives they're running within those areas are consistent with those overall top three goals. Okay.
And so now going back to the kind of what is good is good enough idea. You've said, I've heard you say before that one of the skills that really strong leaders need to have is knowing what can be good, and that would be good enough. Can you say more about what that means, since I don't even seem to be able to articulate it in English?
Yeah, it's an idea actually that I learned from John Boudreau many years ago, but it really struck home with me about one of the afflictions that we all have as business leaders, particularly in really good businesses, is we want to do everything really, really well. And so if we could do that, life would be good. But actually, life is about choices, and it's about prioritization of investments. And so I break down capabilities into three buckets. One is there are some things that if you do them badly, they will make you lose. But if you do them better than everybody else, that wouldn't mean that you would win because of it. So a very simple example, payroll. If you don't pay your people, if they can't expect that their paycheck's going to hit the bank every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, whatever your pattern is, I promise you that will lead you to significant pain very quickly. All right.
But unless you're dealing with college professors, we seem to be indifferent to that whole payroll thing. But I think you're right in general.
That's because you're doing noble work. But you can imagine the grief that would take over in a business if people just couldn't rely on that as a fundamental. Now, if you did the delivery of paychecks better than everybody else, does that make you win competitively? No, it doesn't. So you really just need to be as good as everybody else. Those examples, you actually don't need to do it yourself. There are plenty of people who do that better than most companies do. So that leads to the logic of outsourcing. And when you outsource, you basically give over the delivery to somebody else and you manage it for cost and quality, but you don't need to do it yourself. There's a whole load of things in business where you have to do it for yourself. That could be for regulatory reasons. It could be for proprietary reasons. Most of them you need to be good at, not average. It is a very, very important difference. You need to be good. But you may not need to be, and you may not be able to be world-class at everything. And world-class means you're better than most other people playing in your space. And a temptation that we need to kind of watch out for as business leaders is, because we want everything to be very good, we actually overinvest in those areas where good is good enough. Not average, but good is good enough. If you overinvest, you're building in cost and complexity, and you're also starving funds from the investments in the things that really, really do make a difference competitively. So there's a third bucket, and again, I tend to see life, I guess, in the sort of the rule of three. But typically, businesses have 2 or 3 areas where you would say, these are the things that make us distinctively better than our competitors. When your CEO goes to make a business pitch to a major customer, maybe a new customer, what is it that they're describing that says, here's why you should do business with my company versus our competitors? Here are the things that we can offer you that other companies can't. Those are your sources of competitive advantage. There, you need to be world-class, right? Because they're the difference that really does make the biggest difference competitively. And in those areas, you need to make sure that you've got the financial capital and expenses to be able to invest in those, because they have the highest payoff. And you need to make sure that your best talent is deployed against those areas because they make the biggest difference. And one way of distinguishing between where is good enough and where does world-class really kick in is, what is your customer prepared to pay for? And that to me has always been a good sort of discipline of most areas in a business. We need to do well. We don't need to do them averagely. We need to do them well. A few areas in our business, we need to do better than everybody else.
So do you have a thought on like what percentage of the organization should be? I mean, clearly the stuff that's outsourced is outsourced, but the things that you keep in-house, what percentage should be based on those things that are driving toward that world-class excellence versus the things that have to be very good, above average, but not that world-class?
I haven't ever thought of it in terms of percentages, but the 80-20 rule is there because over time it seems to play out in a whole host of environments. So I would expect probably 20% of your resources are driving 80% of your competitive advantage. It's probably pretty close to that.
And so would that suggest that we should be, as business leaders, constantly trying to bump up that number, put more of that in the things that drive world-class success versus the others? Or is that a kind of just a fix, that's the way it is in life, and we just need to keep them separate to some extent?
I don't think it's a rule that says, manage it tightly to those percentages. It does seem to be a pattern, though, that plays out over time. Now, companies need to do a lot of things. But I think if you can be very clear about what your sources of competitive advantage are, and just as a discipline, say, is this a company that is very purposeful about making sure that those areas are very, very well funded financially and from a talent point of view? That's probably the most important discipline. The percentages don't really matter. But on the other hand, if you end up in that analysis and you say, because of all of our expenses that we're spending in lots of different areas, we don't have the money or the talent to deploy into our most important priority areas, that's a wake-up call.
So how do you, it's easy for me to understand, particularly from a morale perspective, or trying to keep the culture really strong when you're focusing in on that 20%, because you're really saying, we're going to give you the resources and we want you to be the best in the world. And it's understandable that most people get excited by that. How do you keep the other 80% still motivated to do a good or great job when you're also saying to them, but you don't have to be the best?
Yeah, and that's the question that quite often gets posed in this area. The answer isn't at a function level, all right? So it's not like you're saying marketing's important, finance, you can just be, again, you're never saying to anybody, we want average, all right? We're saying this is important, it needs to be well done, and we have high standards as a company. But it isn't function A versus function B. It's always within a particular function based upon the strategy that your company has right now. And strategies change over time. What are the areas or the capabilities within that function that are particularly important right now? So within my own area then, because you have to kind of eat your own food on this stuff, within my own area, am I prioritizing the roles and the capabilities that are really making a difference to the overall performance of the company right now? And in other areas, making choices about, those are important, I want them to be well done. But if I've got a choice to make about where am I deploying talent, where am I deploying expense, I'm going to make sure that I am investing in those highest priority areas first. Not all businesses are equal within business portfolios. Businesses play different roles. I think one of the traps that companies get into is this kind of sameness that all businesses have to grow, all businesses have the same right to capital. It's not true. It's a portfolio, and different businesses, if they've got higher growth potential, you're going to invest more capital in those areas. Other businesses, now, they're very important. They produce cash flow that enables you to maintain competitiveness in this area and fund your growth ventures. But different businesses have different roles within the portfolio. Business leaders understand that logic. They actually also understand the logic of, we can't be great at everything, let's make choices. And now you're just playing that through from a talent and capabilities point of view.
Right, now switching gears a little, because the last year and a half have obviously been quite traumatic in a lot of ways. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the bigger lessons that you think you've gained, especially regarding HR, through this whole pandemic time?
Yeah, my fundamental observation is that companies got the HR functions that they deserved over the last 18 months. And so I think in the main, companies have done very well in protecting the health of their employees and still meeting the needs of their customers, and doing that in radically different ways. But I think there's a clear difference. You can just see it in the way that different companies are articulating their response to the pandemic. Some, I think, really did put their people at the heart of this and say that we don't have a business unless we're really protecting the health of our employees. And if we make that our priority, they'll figure out how to meet the needs of our customers. And if we do that well, the financials tend to work their way through. And so I think companies that have really understood and have embraced HR at kind of the center of their business have got really good payback, more than 100 cents on the dollar over the last 18 months. And companies that viewed HR as sort of an administrative execution organization, they've probably got what they expected as well. And there should be a discernible difference between the two.
And do you see that playing out over the long term? Like how do you see, if there is an advantage to those companies that did HR well and put their people in the appropriate position compared to those that maybe focus just on cutting costs more? How do you see that playing out going forward?
I think it's going to become pretty definitive. So I think everybody is obviously having to rethink sometimes how they compete as businesses, how the work gets done, or all of those issues. But I think I see sort of two tendencies in companies, maybe actually three tendencies in companies. You see some, and fortunately, I think it's a smaller subset, but some pretty prominent companies in the subset who can't wait to go back to what they had before the pandemic. I want my people back in the office. People don't work unless you're stood over their shoulder, and productivity, we need to sort of supervise them. There are some companies who are clearly can't wait to go back to how life was before. There are a small subset of companies who clearly took this as an opportunity to say, look, this is a terrible experience for mankind, and let's never forget how terrible it's been. But there's a silver lining on every cloud. Let's use this as a springboard into a future that we get to define now. And then there's a third set that are kind of in the middle thinking about it. Prudential, we decided 6 weeks into the pandemic, we're not going back to where we were before. We're going to use this as an opportunity to really springboard into the future, actually to accelerate a number of notions that we've been working on in terms of the future of work. I was saying it's not about the future of work anymore, we're in it, right? So let's use this as an opportunity to really accelerate some of the trends that we saw were important, because they're going to become even more important as we move forward. So I think the companies that are seriously looking at now, what's the work of the company? What's the work that really makes a difference? How does that work get done? Where, by whom? All of those things. I think that's the new capability for HR. And I think the companies that are being ambitious and creative about that are opening up new sources of competitive advantage. One example that I think everybody's talking about right now is work used to be tied to a particular role in a particular location. We found out through really serendipity over the last 18 months that work can be done from pretty much anywhere. And therefore, if that's true, that opens up access to new pockets of talent that you wouldn't have been able to go after before. So the more flexible you are in terms of thinking about how and where work gets done, you're opening up new pockets of talent that now you have access to that you wouldn't have if you were only recruiting within a particular geographical area. But there are legion examples of those kinds of thoughts that I think are available to us now as leaders.
So as you said, you've identified a number of places where the HR function is really changing to address this, what you've called, it's not even the future workplace, it's the current workplace now, or the current workplace is the future workplace. What are you doing to work with employees and stakeholders to really move this along as quickly as possible?
Well, I think it starts with the obligation that we have as chief HR officers is to be hopefully thought leaders in that area. So seeing the opportunities that are available to us because of the new conditions within which we're all kind of forced to operate. And building some alignment around the senior team about actually, there are some opportunities here that we've not been able to go after before. And if we have that alignment, then really turning those into potential strategies going forward. At the same time, we've done actually a lot more surveying of employees over the last 18 months than we used to do. Ranging from health and safety issues, how are you doing? And we really cared about the answer. What is it that we can do to make sure that you feel safe so that you can perform and meet the needs of your customers? How are your families doing? What support can we give you there? Through to let's think about what does the office mean in the future? What's important to you about how you work going forward? How important is flexibility? So this combination, and I think it's always true of senior leaders provide overall direction, they solicit input from the organization as they go along, and they continue to iterate those ideas based upon that input. But leaders are there to lead and to provide a way forward. And that's been the pattern that we've been using in our company.
So it sounds pretty challenging to me to even think about what will be these new ideas. I mean, you've been in the business a long time. How are you creative enough to even think about what a generation or two or three behind, younger at least, will really want to be most productive in that workforce, and then get that balance? Because certainly the younger people don't always know. They might know what they think they want now, but not necessarily what's best for the overall workforce or even for themselves.
Yeah, and it's not just the younger people either. I think it's everybody in the organization. People in their 50s and 60s have got needs as well. And actually, you'd be surprised by how progressive people are throughout all stages of their careers. So I tend to get energized by big, complex problems to solve. I'm not a great kind of business as usual, steady state leader. And there are people that would do this job better than me if that were the requirement. So I love the intrigue of this is it's either a big challenge or could it actually be a big opportunity for us? And does it give us optionality or potential advantages that other people haven't thought of yet? So you don't need to have solved every aspect of the problem to move forward directionally either. I think sometimes, again, this sort of need for perfection gets in the way. I'm pretty convinced we've got the right direction in terms of where we're going. I'm also convinced we're going to adapt and change it as we go along based upon experience and getting input again from employees and all of our stakeholders. But that's different from let's not move until we've figured 100% of this out. I think we need to move and learn as we move.
And how do you balance these needs across these different stakeholders? Because it seems like in the context, particularly of the pandemic, a lot of the issues, like, are you working from home? Is your pay going to be based on location, et cetera, has become really quite polarized. So how do you ensure trying to balance those, what seem like competing priorities?
It's always been true. That's our role, is that there have always been a range of perspectives from within the organization, from your customers, regulators, activists. And so part of the role of the C-suite is to understand or seek out what those perspectives are, and then come up with your own set of trade-offs and prioritization so that you can provide clarity to the organization and move forward. I think in this area, I don't see them actually underneath it all as that competing. I think there are a number of underlying needs that tend to span across the multiple perspectives that you get. And if you get deep enough into what's the problem that we're really trying to solve, you can actually come up with solutions that meet the needs that are being articulated maybe in a different way, but you can get alignment on most of this. And at the heart of it, I think people want to know, firstly, are your customers going to be taken care of? That's the most important thing. Are you taking care of your employees? And because of those two things, are you going to be a good citizen within the society? And are you going to meet the needs of your shareholders and the other stakeholders that are important?
So Lucien, I have to let you go because you're going to go talk to our students now, but I really sincerely always love talking to you. But before I do, can I ask you for one kind of CES advertisement, I suppose it would be?
Yeah.
So Lucien, you are the chair of the Center for Executive Succession. And can you say a little bit to us about why that center is important and why you were willing to invest so much of your time in the center?
Well, executive succession is one of the most important things that we do. In fact, if you ask boards of directors what's the most important decision that they are involved in, 95% of board members will say it's the choice of the CEO. And obviously it isn't just the CEO, but that's the most important one. And given the importance of this, it's critical that we understand what helps that happen effectively so that companies can thrive and succeed. And then what are those traps and pitfalls that companies live through so that we can learn from those? And my association with the CES is basically because I get two things at once. One is I get actually world-class faculty who are deep in the concepts and the research around this area and can really bring academic rigor to what really happens and what are the patterns and principles that we can all learn from. And the second thing I get is a great peer group of chief HR officers from very fine companies who tend to represent the best thinking within their businesses. And the combination of world-class faculty and really good companies with peers that I admire and enjoy working with is just something that I treasure. And so I do this by choice. Nobody tells me I need to do this, but I do it because I get a tremendous amount from it, and I learn a lot along the way.
You just listened to another CHRO conversation. Today, Lucien Alziari of Prudential Financial shared his views about how HR drives business success. He also reminded us of the importance of recognizing how HR should prioritize the issues that drive organizational success, including making sure that we are truly focusing on ensuring that the company has the talent and capabilities to win. On behalf of all of us who are associated with the Master of Human Resources program and the Center for Executive Succession here at the University of South Carolina, thank you for joining us.